My father-in-law told my husband that if he married me, he would get nothing. My husband stayed. We spent 25 years scraping by on a high school teacher's salary and my archivist paycheck, clipping coupons while his family sat on a sugarcane fortune just 40 miles away. Last month, our daughter Mia got married. My father-in-law sat in the back row, uninvited. When Mia gave her speech, she did not read traditional vows. She held up a letter. The letter her grandfather sent 25 years ago, disinheriting her father, and she read it out loud to a silent room. By the end, the rigid patriarch of St. Martin Parish was weeping. He left early. The next morning, his corporate lawyer called me in a panic. Welcome back to Maya Tells Stories. If you know what it feels like to be punished for someone else's pride, please drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back 6 weeks before that wedding to the exact moment I realized the war with my father-in-law was far from over. August in Acadiana is not just hot. The humidity wraps around your throat and refuses to let go. I stood in the gravel parking lot of a historic barn on the banks of Bayou Teche, sweat plastering my blouse to my spine. My fingers gripped a rusted iron padlock securing the heavy cypress doors. Tacked directly at eye level was a bright yellow foreclosure notice. This barn was Mia's wedding venue. We had paid a $5,000 deposit 12 months ago. The money represented 2 years of strict budgeting, skipping oil changes, and working overtime at the Parish Historical Society. And now the venue was bankrupt. The owner vanished. The doors were chained shut. Mia was at her veterinary clinic, blissfully unaware that her perfect day had just evaporated. I could not bring myself to call my husband Lucas. He carried enough guilt about our financial limitations. I needed to fix this before either of them found out. I retreated to the sweltering cabin of my 12-year-old sedan. The steering wheel burned the palms of my hands. I pulled out my phone and navigated to our local credit union portal. I requested a rapid personal loan for $5,000. The interest rate was steep, but I figured I could pick up weekend shifts sorting archival records to cover the monthly payments. I hit submit and sat in the stagnant heat, listening to the cicadas hum in the Spanish moss. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. The loan officer on the other end sounded uncomfortable. She called me Cher, a local term of endearment that usually implies bad news. She explained that my application was denied. I asked her to run it again, reminding her that my credit score was spotless. She cleared her throat and stated that my credit score was fine, but a sudden legal lien had been filed against my name early that morning. The lien froze my borrowing capacity. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked her who filed it. She read the name off her screen. Elias Thorne, my father-in-law. The man who had ignored our existence for 2.5 decades had just crippled my finances 6 weeks before his granddaughter's wedding. I hung up the phone. The air inside the car felt too thin. I pushed my door open, stepping back onto the gravel. A blinding, defensive rage surged through my chest. I marched back to the foreclosed barn. I pulled my leg back and kicked the weathered cypress siding. The impact sent a shockwave up my shin. The wood splintered and the heel of my right shoe snapped off. I stood there, lopsided, staring at the broken piece of leather on the dirt. I picked it up. With a raw, ugly scream that tore at my throat, I hurled the broken shoe straight into the murky, slow-moving waters of the bayou. The splash broke the stillness of the afternoon. My foot was bruised, my bank account was frozen, and the most powerful landowner in the parish had just declared war on my family. I drove away from the bayou with one shoe missing and my mind burning. Driving through St. Martin Parish usually brought me a sense of peace. The landscape here is ancient. Small towns connected by 2-lane highways running alongside sugarcane fields that stretch toward the horizon. But today, the lush green stalks looked like prison bars. I was not going home to cry to Lucas. I was going to find out exactly how Elias Thorne was destroying us. I pulled into the employee lot of the Parish Historical Society. My office was housed in a brick building built just after the Civil War. It smelled permanently of damp paper and old wood. Normally, civilians have to submit a formal request to view property disputes, paying a fee and waiting 10 business days for the county clerk to process the paperwork. I did not have 10 days. I barely had 10 minutes before my anxiety swallowed me whole. I limped past the front desk, offering a tight nod to Valerie, the head clerk. She was leaning over the counter, blowing on a steaming cup of chicory coffee, complaining to a researcher about how the upcoming sugarcane harvest was going to ruin her commute with tractor traffic. She did not notice my uneven gait or the frantic set of my jaw. I moved straight to the back room, bypassing the public archives entirely. I sat down at the secure administrative terminal. My fingers hit the keyboard with enough force to echo in the quiet room. I typed in my employee identification number, accessing the restricted county deed registry. I searched for my own name first. The screen populated a list of documents. At the very top sat a fresh filing, time-stamped just 3 days prior, a formal boundary dispute. Elias Thorne had placed a hold on a 15-acre tract of marshland I inherited when my father died. He was claiming that the original surveys from the 1970s were fraudulent and that the marshland technically belonged to the Thorne agricultural estate. By challenging the title, he effectively rendered the land worthless as collateral, which triggered the automatic freeze on my credit profile. I stared at the glowing monitor, a sickening realization washing over me. This was not a random administrative error. This was a targeted strike. My father was a charismatic man, but he was also a known local swindler. He made his living finding loopholes in property lines, flipping useless land to gullible buyers, and dodging creditors until the day his heart gave out. I spent my entire adult life trying to outrun his shadow. I paid my taxes early. I never borrowed money I could not immediately repay. I chose a career preserving history specifically because I wanted an honest, quiet life. But Elias Thorne never forgot where I came from. When Lucas walked away from the family fortune to marry me, Elias made it very clear that he viewed me as a parasite, a gold digger cut from the same cloth as my father. For 25 years, Elias ignored us. He never sent a birthday card to Mia. He never called Lucas on holidays. Now, mere weeks before Mia's wedding, he decides to dispute a worthless patch of mud. The timing was too precise. He knew Lucas was struggling on a teacher's salary. He knew weddings required capital. He was intentionally choking off our access to funds to punish Lucas for choosing me. I clicked deeper into the filing. The dispute was not filed by Elias's usual local attorney. The paperwork bore the header of a massive corporate law firm based out of Baton Rouge. These were high-powered litigators who billed hundreds of dollars an hour. Elias was utilizing a corporate wrecking ball to crush an ant. I navigated away from the property dispute and opened the search parameters. I typed in the name of Elias's holding company. If he was deploying corporate lawyers, I needed to see his structural flank. The system flagged several documents categorized under Restricted Trust Administration. These files contained confidential financial restructuring outlines for the Thorne estate. As an archivist, I am sworn to protect the integrity and privacy of these records. Accessing them without a judicial order or a direct research mandate is a severe violation of parish protocols. It is grounds for immediate termination. I looked over my shoulder. The administrative room was empty. The scent of old paper felt suddenly suffocating. I clicked the print command. The heavy laser printer in the corner hummed to life. I stood by the output tray, watching page after page of confidential corporate filings slide out. I felt a cold, terrifying thrill course through my veins. My professional ethics, the moral high ground I had so carefully maintained to prove I was nothing like my father, crumbled under the weight of my desperation. I gathered the warm papers, tapping the edges on the desk to align them perfectly. I folded the stack and shoved it deep into my leather tote bag. I did not care about the rules anymore. Elias wanted to play dirty, leveraging his immense wealth to starve my family. I was going to read every single line of his private trust documents. I was going to find a vulnerability, a misfiled tax form, an overlooked zoning violation, anything I could use as leverage. I planned to march onto his pristine estate and promised to drag his private corporate restructuring into a very public, very ugly parish zoning hearing, unless he dropped the lien on my land. I logged out of the terminal, grabbed my bag, and walked back out through the lobby. Valerie was still talking about the tractors. I pushed the heavy front doors open, stepping back out into the blistering heat. I had the ammunition. Now, I just needed to look the monster directly in the eye. I drove south down Highway 31, leaving the familiar borders of my town for the expansive, isolated territory of St. Martin Parish. The landscape shifted dramatically. The modest brick homes and cramped strip malls gave way to massive tracts of open agricultural land. This was thorn territory. The sugarcane stalks rose high on either side of the asphalt, forming a dense green wall that blocked out the horizon. I turned my car onto the private gravel road leading to the Thorne estate. The driveway was legendary in this part of Louisiana, lined with ancient live oaks planted over a century ago. From a distance, they looked like guardians of southern aristocracy, their branches draped heavily in Spanish moss, creating a majestic canopy that shielded the property from the brutal sun. But as my tires crunched over the gravel, I noticed the details the glossy local magazines always cropped out. Up close, the mighty oaks were dying. Several of the massive trunks were split open, their cores hollowed out by rot and insect damage. They were standing on sheer structural memory, hollow giants projecting an illusion of strength. It was a fitting introduction to Elias's world. The main house sat at the end of the drive, a sprawling, white-pillared structure designed to project untouchable wealth. It was beautiful, but it was built on the back-breaking, sweaty labor of generations of field workers. I parked my rusted sedan next to a pristine luxury truck. I killed the engine. My hands gripped the steering wheel, damp with nervous sweat. Inside my leather tote bag sat the stolen corporate filings. I rehearsed my lines one final time. I was going to be cold, clinical, and unyielding. I was going to use the restricted documents to force a negotiation. I stepped out of the car, ignoring my missing shoe, choosing to walk with a slight, deliberate limp rather than show weakness. I climbed the wide brick stairs to the wraparound veranda. The air up here felt cooler, shaded by the deep overhang of the roof. Elias Thorne was sitting in a high-backed wooden rocking chair near the far end of the porch. I had not seen him in person since the day Lucas and I got married at a small Justice of the Peace office. Back then, Elias was a terrifying physical presence. He was a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice that could halt a tractor engine. The man sitting in the rocking chair today was a stranger. He looked shrunken, his expensive linen shirt hanging loosely off his frame. His skin was pale, mapped with deep age spots, and his hands rested unsteadily on a wooden cane. The Titan of St. Martin Parish looked incredibly fragile. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of unwanted pity tightened my chest. Then I remembered the foreclosure notice on the barn door. I remembered Lucas working late nights grading history papers just to pay our electric bill, while this man hoarded millions. I closed the distance, my footsteps loud against the wooden floorboards. Elias did not turn his head immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the endless green fields stretching out past the lawn. "I know you hear me, Elias," I stated, forcing my voice to maintain a sharp, even pitch. He slowly turned his head. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, locked onto mine. There was no surprise in his expression, no flicker of recognition that implied I was family. He looked at me the way one might look at a stray dog wandering onto a manicured lawn. I suppose the security gate is malfunctioning again, Elias rasped. His voice was thin, lacking the booming resonance of my memory, but it still carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "What do you want, Gianna?" I stood tall, clutching the strap of my tote bag. "I want you to release the lien on my property," I demanded. "I pulled the parish filings an hour ago. I know you hired a corporate firm in Baton Rouge to dispute the boundary lines. It is a petty, baseless claim, and you know it." Elias picked up a glass of iced tea resting on a small wicker side table. His hand trembled slightly, the ice clinking against the glass. He took a slow sip, refusing to be rushed. "It is not a baseless claim," he countered, setting the glass down. "Your father was a con artist. He manipulated the parish surveyors in 1978 to slice off 15 acres of my marshland. I am simply reclaiming what rightfully belongs to my estate." "My father has been dead for a decade," I shot back, the anger flaring hot in my throat. "You did not care about that marshland until this week. You waited until you knew Mia was getting married. You intentionally froze my assets to ruin her wedding because you are still punishing Lucas for choosing me." I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing against the stolen corporate trust documents. This was the moment. This was where I deployed my leverage. "Lucas sent me," I lied, deploying the bluff I had rehearsed in the car. I needed Elias to believe he was dealing with his son's wrath, not just mine. "Lucas knows exactly what you are doing. He knows about the corporate restructuring you are trying to hide behind those Baton Rouge lawyers. He told me to come here and give you one chance to drop the lien quietly before he takes this entire dispute to a public zoning hearing." Elias stopped rocking. The chair settled into stillness. He stared at me, his pale eyes unblinking. The fragile appearance vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating intelligence that felt entirely predatory. He let out a low, dry chuckle that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Lucas did not send you," Elias stated, dismantling my lie with effortless precision. "My son is a coward who avoids conflict at all costs. He walked away from this empire because he lacked the spine to manage it. He would never send his wife to fight his battles. You came here on your own, Gianna, because you are desperate." My throat went dry. The corporate documents suddenly felt incredibly heavy in my bag. "You are just like your father," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "A grifter looking for a quick payout. You think you can march onto my property, throw my son's name around, and extort me? I know your daughter is getting married. I know you do not have the capital to fund it. You came here expecting me to write a check just to make you go away. It will not happen." The fierce, authoritative facade I had built shattered. The air left my lungs. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to pull the documents from my bag and threaten him with the public exposure of his trust. But the words caught in my throat. I looked at his cold, unyielding face, and an overwhelming wave of humiliation washed over me. I was standing on his porch with one shoe, sweating through my blouse, attempting to blackmail a dying man. I felt exactly like the cheap swindler he accused me of being. "I am not asking for your money," I stuttered, my voice cracking humiliatingly. I just want you to leave us alone." "You are trespassing," Elias replied, turning his gaze back to the sugarcane fields, dismissing me entirely. Before I could regain my footing, the heavy wooden front door swung open. A man stepped onto the veranda. He was in his late 60s, wearing practical work boots and a faded denim shirt. This was Broussard, Elias's longtime estate manager. He had the rugged, weathered look of a man who spent his life managing land, but his eyes were sharp and watchful. "Mr. Thorne requested you leave the property," Broussard said, stepping between me and the rocking chair. His tone was polite but firm, carrying the implicit threat of physical removal if I refused. I looked from Broussard to Elias, the bitter taste of defeat coating my tongue. I had played my hand and lost spectacularly. I turned on my heel, the uneven gait making my retreat look pathetic, and walked back down the brick stairs. I climbed into my sweltering car, throwing my tote bag onto the passenger seat. As I drove back down the long avenue of hollow oaks, I realized the corporate documents were useless. Elias was not afraid of a public hearing. He welcomed a fight. I needed a different weapon. If I could not attack his future, I needed to dig into his past. I had to find the original survey documents my father used. I needed empirical proof that the marshland was mine, something undeniable enough to force a judge to lift the lien before Mia discovered the truth about her venue. And I knew exactly where Lucas kept the oldest boxes of family records. I just had to wait for him to leave the house so I could tear apart our own attic. The morning sun baked the roof of our house, trapping the thick Louisiana heat inside the attic long before noon. I waited by the kitchen window until the taillights of Lucas's sedan disappeared down the street. He was heading to the high school to teach his junior history classes, entirely unaware that our daughter's wedding venue was chained shut. He did not know about the foreclosure. He did not know his father had frozen our assets, and he certainly did not know I had spent yesterday afternoon standing on his family's veranda, being humiliated by the man who disinherited him. I walked into the hallway and pulled the frayed nylon cord hanging from the ceiling. The wooden attic stairs groaned as they unfolded. A wave of stagnant, dusty air washed over my face. I climbed up into the darkness, pulling a solitary pull-chain bulb that cast harsh, swinging shadows against the exposed fiberglass insulation. I needed my father's original land surveys. If Elias was using high-priced corporate lawyers to challenge the boundaries of my marshland, I had to find the empirical proof that the tract belonged to me. My father kept meticulous, albeit chaotic, records of his real estate schemes. I crawled over discarded holiday decorations and boxes of Mia's childhood clothes, making my way to the back corner, where a stack of cardboard banker's boxes sat untouched for a decade. I tore open the first box, sifting through yellowed tax returns and unpaid invoices. My hands were coated in a fine layer of gray grime. The heat pressed down on my shoulders, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I pushed the first box aside and opened the second. My fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. It was not a manila folder or a rolled-up architectural blueprint. It was a heavy steel lockbox, the kind you buy at a hardware store to store cash or ammunition. I pulled it out into the dim light. The surface was cold. My father never used lockboxes. He preferred to keep his secrets in filing cabinets under fake corporate names. This belonged to Lucas. The small brass latch hung loose, the locking mechanism broken years ago. I sat back on my heels, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist. A sharp pang of guilt struck my chest. Spying on my husband's private belongings felt like a betrayal. But the desperation radiating from the foreclosure notice in my car pushed my hesitation aside. I flipped the latch and opened the heavy lid. There was no money inside. There were no hidden bank statements or secret deeds. Resting on top was a single, faded index card. I picked it up. The edges were stained with what looked like dried rue and oil. Written in delicate, sweeping cursive was a recipe for crawfish étouffée. I recognized the handwriting from old greeting cards stored in our photo albums. It belonged to Lucas's mother. She passed away long before I ever met him, succumbing to a sudden illness when Lucas was just a teenager. The recipe card was a painful relic of a woman he loved, a piece of the family he lost before his father's bitterness consumed the Thorne estate. Holding it felt like trespassing on a sacred memory. I prepared to place the recipe back inside the box and close the lid, but a glint of thick, cream-colored stationery caught my eye. Beneath the recipe card lay a folded letter. The paper bore the unmistakable embossed crest of the Thorne Agricultural Empire. My pulse quickened. I set the recipe aside and picked up the letter. The paper felt heavy, expensive. I unfolded it, the crease stiff from decades of remaining shut. The date inked in the top right corner was exactly 25 years ago, the month Lucas and I got married. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and aggressively slanted. It was Elias Thorne's handwriting. I read the first line, and the stagnant air in the attic seemed to vanish, leaving me gasping. Elias did not write a fatherly warning. He wrote a manifesto of hatred. The ink detailed his sheer disgust for my existence. He called my father a common thief who poisoned the parish with cheap cons. He wrote that my bloodline was polluted with deceit and that by marrying me, Lucas was infecting the Thorne legacy. But the final paragraph was the most venomous. Elias wrote that Lucas would be stripped of his name. He predicted that without the Thorne fortune, Lucas would fail at everything he attempted. He promised that Lucas would spend his life scraping by on pennies, drowning in the mediocrity of a working-class existence, and that he would die with nothing to show for his life but the burden of a parasitic wife. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. The letters blurred as tears of hot, blistering rage pooled in my eyes. The heartache of reading those words morphed rapidly into a dark, irrational betrayal directed squarely at my husband. Why did Lucas keep this? Why would he preserve the very weapon his father used to cut him down? For a quarter of a century, while we clipped coupons, drove rusted cars, and lost sleep over medical bills, Lucas kept this letter hidden in the dark. It was a silent monument to his father's judgment. A sickening thought took root in my mind. Did Lucas read this letter when things got hard? Did he look at our modest life and wonder if Elias was right? My fear regarding the foreclosed wedding venue and the frozen assets twisted into a deep, defensive fury. I folded the letter, leaving the recipe card inside the metal box. I climbed down the wooden stairs, my hands shaking. I walked into our bedroom. The sheets were still rumpled on Lucas's side of the mattress. I took the thick, embossed letter and placed it squarely on his pillow. It was a trap. A deliberate, passive-aggressive landmine waiting for him to step on. I wanted him to feel the sting of his father's words today. I wanted him to stop pretending that walking away 25 years ago magically erased the damage. I spent the rest of the day pacing the hardwood floors of our small house, the silence amplifying the erratic drumming of my heart. At 4 o'clock, the front door rattled. Lucas walked in, dropping his canvas briefcase onto the entryway table. He loosened his necktie, rolling his shoulders to release the tension of managing 30 teenagers for 8 hours. He smelled of whiteboard markers and stale cafeteria coffee. He offered me a tired, genuine smile. "Hey," he said, walking into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. "How was your day?" I stood by the kitchen island, leaning my hip against the counter to hide the trembling in my knees. I looked directly into the eyes of the man who had stood by me through decades of hardship, and I lied without hesitation. "It was fine," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Just catching up on archiving. Yours?" "Long," he sighed, drinking the water. "I need to change out of these work clothes." I watched him set the glass down and walk down the hallway toward our bedroom. My chest tightened. I counted his footsteps. 1, 2, 3, 4. The bedroom door clicked shut. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. When Lucas walked back out into the hallway, the color had entirely drained from his face. His skin carried a sickly, ashen pallor. He held the letter in his right hand, his knuckles white from gripping the paper so tightly. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen, his eyes locking onto mine. "Why were you going through my things, Gianna?" he asked. His voice was low, carrying a dangerous, suppressed tremor I had rarely heard in our 25 years of marriage. "I was looking for my father's land surveys," I shot back, dropping the calm facade. Because your father filed a legal dispute on my marshland yesterday. He placed a lien on my name. He froze my credit, Lucas. Mia's wedding venue went bankrupt this morning, and I cannot secure a loan to fix it because your father is actively bankrupting us from his porch. Lucas blinked, the shock of the foreclosure and the lien hitting him simultaneously. But his defensive instincts overrode the new information. He raised the letter, stepping into the kitchen. "So you decided to dig up something that has nothing to do with this," he demanded, his voice rising in volume. "This letter is 25 years old. It is none of your business." "None of my business?" I yelled, the pent-up frustration of the last 48 hours exploding. "He called me a parasite. He predicted you would die in poverty. And you kept it. You hid it in a lockbox like a prized possession. Why, Lucas? Do you read it when we cannot afford to fix the car? Do you agree with him?" "Stop it," Lucas warned, his jaw clenching. "You do not understand why I kept it. You have no idea what it felt like to walk away from my own blood." "I know what it feels like to be attacked right now," I countered, stepping toward him, pointing a finger at his chest. "I went to his estate yesterday. I begged him to drop the lien. He looked right through me. He is using expensive corporate lawyers to crush us, and you are sitting here protecting a piece of paper he wrote to destroy your self-esteem. You need to drive to Eccles Street, Martin Parish, and stand up to your father." "You went to his house?" Lucas asked, his expression shifting from anger to profound betrayal. "You went behind my back to beg my father for mercy?" "Someone had to do something," I screamed, projecting my own failure onto him, "because you would rather hide in a classroom than confront the man ruining our daughter's wedding." The words hung in the air, sharp and unforgivable. I had crossed a line, weaponizing his trauma to cover my own missteps. Lucas stared at me, the hurt in his eyes hardening into a cold, impenetrable wall. He did not yell back. He carefully folded the letter, slipped it into his pocket, and turned toward the front door. He grabbed his car keys from the table. "I am going for a drive," he stated flatly. The door shut behind him, leaving me standing alone in the quiet kitchen. The peace of our household was shattered, fractured beyond repair just weeks before Mia was supposed to walk down the aisle. I had driven away the only person who was on my side. I sank into one of the dining chairs, dropping my face into my hands, the exhaustion finally pulling me under. A sharp buzz broke the silence. My phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. I lifted my head, wiping my eyes, and picked up the device. The screen illuminated with a text message from an unknown number. I tapped the notification. The message was brief. It contained an address for a local diner situated on the edge of town, followed by a single sentence: "I know a way around the corporate lawyers. Meet me in 30 minutes. Come alone." It was signed by Broussard, the same estate manager who had escorted me off the Thorne property yesterday afternoon. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the blue light reflecting off the dark granite of my kitchen counter. The house was dead quiet. Lucas had driven off, taking his grief and his anger with him. My chest ached from the things we had screamed at each other, but the text message demanding my attention offered no time for regret. Broussard, the estate manager who had treated me like a trespasser just 24 hours ago, was offering a backdoor negotiation. I grabbed my keys, leaving the kitchen dark. The drive to the edge of town took 20 minutes. I navigated the back roads, the dense summer night pressing against the windshield. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a neon-lit establishment called Thibodeau's Grill. It was a cinder block building hunkered down near the parish line, a place where sugarcane workers and deckhands drank cheap beer and ate heavy meals after a grueling shift. I stepped through the heavy glass door. The air conditioning was fighting a losing battle against the heat radiating from the kitchen. The air hung thick with the heavy, savory scent of frying boudin and dark roux. A dozen men in mud-stained work boots and faded denim sat at the laminate tables. The background chatter was a rapid, rhythmic stream of Cajun French. I had lived in Acadiana for decades, but the dialect still sounded impenetrable to my ears, an exclusive language that reminded me I was an outsider in Thorn territory. I spotted Broussard sitting in a corner booth. He wore a crisp plaid button-down shirt tucked into dark jeans, his posture relaxed. A half-empty cup of black coffee rested on the table in front of him. I walked over and slid into the cracked red vinyl seat across from him. I did not offer a greeting. My nerves were frayed, my defenses dialed to their highest setting. Broussard signaled a passing waitress. She dropped a tall glass of iced tea in front of me, the condensation immediately pooling on the scratched table. "I appreciate you coming on short notice, Gianna," Broussard said. His voice was calm, possessing the steady cadence of a man accustomed to waiting out storms. "Skip the pleasantries," I snapped, leaning forward. "You threw me off the property yesterday. Today you want to make a deal? What changed?" "Nothing changed," Broussard replied, tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Elias instructed me to remove you from the veranda, so I did. My job is to protect the Thorn estate. But the definition of protection is shifting. Elias is not the man he used to be. His memory slips, his temper flares without reason, and those corporate lawyers from Baton Rouge are exploiting his decline." "I do not care about his mental health or his lawyers," I countered, my voice rising above the diner chatter. "He froze my assets. He is trying to ruin my daughter's wedding just to punish Lucas, and you are sitting here playing the loyal lapdog while he does it." I punctuated the insult with a sharp wave of my hand. My knuckles clipped the side of the tall glass. The heavy tumbler tipped, crashing onto the laminate table. Ice cubes scattered across the surface. A tidal wave of sweetened tea flooded the booth, soaking the cheap paper napkins and splashing onto Broussard's pristine plaid cuffs. My fierce, authoritative posture evaporated. I scrambled to grab the remaining dry napkins, my face burning with a dark, humiliating flush. I was trying to act like a ruthless negotiator, and instead, I was a frantic, clumsy mess, spilling drinks in a roadside diner. Broussard did not flinch. He did not reprimand me. He calmly pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the tea from his wrist. He watched me mop up the spill, his sharp eyes evaluating my panic. "You are exhausted, Gianna," he said softly. "You are fighting a war you cannot win on your own. You need a venue for Mia's wedding. The barn on Bayou Teche foreclosed this morning. I know you lost your $5,000 deposit." I froze, the soggy napkins clutched in my fist. "How do you know about the barn?" "I manage real estate across 3 parishes," Broussard stated. "I hear when properties go into receivership. I also know you tried to secure a rapid loan this afternoon and failed because of the lien Elias filed against your marshland." He leaned closer, the diner noise fading into the background. "The Baton Rouge lawyers convinced Elias to file that lien," Broussard explained. "They bill by the hour. They want a protracted, ugly legal battle because it lines their pockets. They are bleeding the estate dry while Elias loses his grip on reality. I want those lawyers gone. I want to settle this boundary dispute quietly, out of court, before they consume the legacy I spent 40 years helping Elias build." I dropped the wet napkins onto the table. "How?" Broussard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the table, avoiding the puddle of tea. "Inside this envelope is a quitclaim deed," Broussard said. "It legally surrenders your claim to the 15 acres of marshland your father surveyed. If you sign this land over to an administrative holding company I manage, the boundary dispute vanishes. The corporate lawyers lose their leverage, and the lien drops off your credit profile within 48 hours. "You want me to surrender my family's land to you?" I asked, my voice tight with suspicion. "Why should I trust you?" "Because of what else is in the envelope," he countered. I hesitated, then picked up the damp envelope. I pulled open the brass clasp. Inside sat a pristine legal document, and resting on top of it was a heavy iron key on a leather ring. The Catholic Diocese owns an old parish hall on the edge of St. Martinville, Broussard said. It is a beautiful building. Hardwood floors, stained glass, a large commercial kitchen. I manage the property for the church. It sits vacant most of the year. If you sign the quitclaim deed tonight, the parish hall is yours for the wedding weekend. No deposit required, no rental fee. Mia gets her perfect day, and the Thorne estate avoids a highly publicized, expensive court battle. I stared at the iron key resting on the table. It was a lifeline thrown into a drowning sea. If I took this deal, the foreclosure nightmare would end. Mia would never even have to know her original venue went bankrupt. I would not have to grovel for high-interest loans. But taking this deal meant surrendering my father's legacy to the man who served my greatest enemy. It meant giving Elias exactly what he wanted. I looked up at Broussard. He sat patiently, projecting the image of a weary pragmatist trying to save his boss from corporate vultures. He framed this as a mutual victory. We were supposedly outsmarting the expensive litigators together. I ask you to pause for a moment and consider this scenario. Do you trust a deal offered in the shadows by your enemy's right-hand man? Would you sign away your inheritance to secure your child's happiness, even if every instinct warned you a trap was waiting? Drop your thoughts below. Sitting in that diner, smelling the heavy grease and listening to the foreign cadence of the local dialect, I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. Lucas was gone, driving through the dark night, furious with me for weaponizing his trauma. I had no one else to rely on. I had to fix the wedding, and the iron key sitting on the table was the only tool available. I signed this deed. "And the parish hall is mine?" I asked, needing verbal confirmation. "You have my word," Broussard said. "The keys are yours. We bypass the lawyers entirely. You protect your daughter, and I protect the estate." I pulled a pen from my purse. My hand shook slightly as I clicked the point into place. I did not read the dense legal jargon filling the pages of the quitclaim deed. I did not scrutinize the specific name of the holding company listed as the recipient. I operated on pure, blind desperation. I pressed the pen to the signature line and signed away the last remaining piece of my father's life. Broussard took the document, inspecting the signature before folding it neatly back into his jacket pocket. He left the iron key on the table. "It is a pleasure doing business with you, Gianna," he said, sliding out of the booth. "The parish hall is unlocked. You can inspect it tomorrow." He turned and walked out of the diner, disappearing into the humid Louisiana night. I sat alone in the booth, staring at the key. I had done it. I had saved the wedding. I had outmaneuvered the high-priced Baton Rouge attorneys and secured a venue without spending a single dime. A sharp, triumphant thrill pierced through my exhaustion. I believed I had won. I picked up the key, dropping it into my purse, and walked out to my car. As I drove back toward my silent house, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, heavy knot of realization. I had just traded away contested property without consulting my husband. I had negotiated with the Thorne estate in secret. I was carrying a massive, unilateral decision into a household that was already fracturing under the weight of old secrets. I pulled into my driveway. The house was dark. Lucas had not returned. I unlocked the front door, the silence of the living room pressing against my eardrums. I walked into the kitchen and dropped my purse onto the counter. The iron key landed with a heavy, metallic thud. I had secured a roof for Mia's reception, but I had no idea how I was going to explain where it came from. I did not realize that while I was sitting in a diner making shadow deals, the truth about the bankrupt barn was already detonating inside my own home, and my daughter was preparing to make a sacrifice that would tear our family apart. The morning sun broke through the kitchen windows, casting harsh, unforgiving light across the scuffed linoleum counter. I stood by the coffee maker, gripping a ceramic mug, exhaustion pulling at the corners of my eyes. Lucas was sitting at the small dining table grading history essays with a red pen. He had returned late last night, sleeping on the edge of the mattress without saying a word. The silence between us was thick, a physical barrier erected after our explosive fight over Elias's cruel letter. I glanced at my purse resting on the chair. The heavy iron key for the Catholic parish hall sat hidden at the bottom. I possessed the solution to our impending crisis, but the secret felt like a block of lead in my chest. The front door opened. Mia walked into the house, wearing her dark blue veterinary scrubs. Usually, she arrived home from her overnight emergency shifts, tired but animated, ready to share stories about anxious pet owners or miraculous recoveries. Today, her face was devoid of color. She looked fragile, clutching her smartphone with both hands. She did not greet us. She walked straight to the kitchen island and dropped her phone onto the counter. The screen displayed a local news article from a regional business blog. "The barn went into receivership," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw it on my feed during my break. The owners declared bankruptcy yesterday morning. The venue is padlocked." Lucas set his red pen down. He looked from the screen to Mia, confusion shifting rapidly into alarm. "What about the deposit?" he asked, standing up. "We paid $5,000 last August." Mia shook her head, tears spilling over her eyelashes, tracing bright paths down her pale cheeks. "It is gone, Dad. The article says they took deposits from a dozen couples and funneled the cash to pay off outstanding commercial loans before filing the paperwork. They are liquidating the property. We are unsecured creditors. We will never see that money again." Lucas dragged a hand over his face, processing the financial blow. I watched him absorb the news, knowing he was rapidly calculating the devastating math in his head. A teacher's salary and an archivist's wages left zero margin for a sudden $5,000 loss, especially with the caterers and florists demanding final payments next week. "I am canceling the wedding," Mia announced. The declaration dropped into the quiet kitchen like a stone. "Mia, no," Lucas protested immediately, stepping toward her. "We will figure this out. We can find another venue. We can take out a small personal loan to cover the gap." "You cannot get a loan," Mia sobbed, her pragmatism turning brutal. "I know how tight your budget is. I know you both skipped your dental checkups this year to pay for my dress. If you borrow money at a high interest rate right now, you will be paying it off until you retire. I am not starting my marriage by bankrupting my parents." She swiped angrily at her tears, her jaw set with a stubborn, desperate resolve. "We will just go to the courthouse on Tuesday. We can have a barbecue in the backyard afterward. It is fine. The party does not matter." I stood frozen by the coffee maker, a wave of crushing guilt rising in my throat. The irony was suffocating. I watched my daughter weeping, preparing to sacrifice a milestone she had dreamed about since childhood, terrified of destroying our financial stability. She was offering to throw her wedding away to protect us from a disaster that no longer existed. I had the parish hall. I had a beautiful, historic venue with hardwood floors and stained glass windows waiting for us, free of charge. I could end her panic with a single sentence. I could pull the iron key from my purse and tell her the reception was saved. But I could not say the words. If I revealed the parish hall, I would have to explain how I acquired it. I would have to admit to Lucas that I met with Broussard in the middle of the night. I would have to confess that I signed away my father's marshland, the very property his father, Elias, had frozen with a legal lien. Lucas would realize I circumvented our marriage, negotiating with the hostile estate that discarded him 25 years ago. The fragile truce holding our relationship together would shatter entirely. So I kept my mouth shut. I watched my daughter cry over a phantom problem, paralyzed by the weight of my own deceit. The doorbell rang, shattering the heavy silence. Lucas walked down the short hallway and opened the door. Mrs. Landry, our neighbor from across the street, stood on the porch holding a large, steaming cast-iron pot. She was an older Acadian woman who treated neighborhood gossip like a competitive sport. "I saw the news about the barn on Facebook this morning," Mrs. Landry announced, her loud voice echoing into the kitchen. "I am so sorry for your trouble, Lucas. I brought over a chicken and sausage gumbo. Figured you folks didn't need to worry about cooking tonight while you sort out the mess." "Thank you, Mrs. Landry," Lucas replied politely, accepting the heavy pot. "That is very kind of you." "Such a shame," she continued, lingering on the threshold, peering past Lucas, trying to catch a glimpse of Mia. "A girl only gets one big day. Let me know if you need to borrow folding chairs for a backyard thing. Folks are talking, offering to pitch in." The gesture was meant to be supportive, but in our tight-knit community, it felt like an inescapable surveillance. Everyone knew we were struggling. Everyone knew the venue was gone. And everyone was waiting to see how the poor teacher and his archivist wife were going to salvage the situation. Lucas closed the door and carried the heavy pot into the kitchen, setting it on the stove. The rich, spicy scent of the gumbo filled the room, a stark contrast to the sterile panic gripping my chest. "We are not having a backyard barbecue," Lucas said, turning back to Mia, his tone firm. "I will call the credit union when they open. I will secure the funds. You are getting the wedding you planned." "I told you no!" Mia yelled, her voice cracking under the strain. "I am not letting you drown in debt for one party. Why are you being so stubborn?" "Because I want to provide for my daughter," Lucas fired back, his own frustration bleeding through his usual patience. "I am your father. Let me handle the finances." "You cannot handle it," Mia cried out, the brutal reality of our working-class life surfacing in an ugly, unguarded moment. "You don't have the money, Dad. You never have." The words struck Lucas like a physical blow. He physically recoiled, the fight draining from his posture. His shoulders slumped, the weight of 25 years of financial insecurity crushing his pride in an instant. He looked at Mia, profound sorrow settling in his eyes. I watched the devastation unfold, the guilt inside me rapidly fermenting into a dark, defensive anger. I could not handle Mia's tears, and I could not endure the sight of Lucas looking so utterly defeated. The pressure cooker inside my mind hissed, demanding an outlet. Instead of confessing my secret, I lashed out, targeting the easiest scapegoat. "It is not your father's fault," I snapped, slamming my ceramic mug onto the counter. The loud clatter startled them both. "It is the Thorne bloodline. It is a curse." Mia stared at me, shocked by the sudden venom in my voice. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "I am talking about your grandfather," I continued, pacing the length of the small kitchen, unable to contain the toxic resentment spilling over. "Elias Thorne froze our credit yesterday. He filed a legal dispute on my land to ensure we could not borrow a single dime. He knew this wedding was coming, and he orchestrated a financial blockade to punish us." I turned toward Lucas, my anger blinding me to the pain on his face. "Thorne men ruin everything they touch. They hoard their wealth and use it to strangle anyone who refuses to bow to them. Your father is actively trying to destroy your daughter's wedding, Lucas, and you are standing here acting like you can fix it with a personal loan?" The silence that followed was suffocating. I had crossed a line, hurling a blanket insult that dragged my husband into the same category as the monster who disowned him. Lucas stared at me. The vulnerability in his eyes hardened into a cold, impenetrable fortress. He did not yell. He did not defend himself or his cursed surname. He simply turned around and walked out of the kitchen, retreating down the hallway toward our bedroom, shutting the door with a quiet, devastating finality. Mia looked at me, horrified by the cruelty of my outburst. "How could you say that to him?" she asked, her voice trembling with disgust. She grabbed her phone from the counter and walked out the front door, seeking refuge in her car. I stood alone in the kitchen, the smell of Mrs. Landry's gumbo turning my stomach. I had achieved my goal. I had deflected their attention away from my secret negotiation with Broussard. I had saved the wedding day by securing the parish hall, but the cost of my deception was staggering. I was standing in the wreckage of my own making, actively destroying my marriage to hide the truth. The silence in my house became unbearable. Lucas remained barricaded in the bedroom, and Mia had driven off to her veterinary shift without saying goodbye. The weight of my cruel outburst pressed against my ribs, making it hard to draw a full breath. I needed to get out. I needed to see the venue I had traded my father's legacy to secure. I grabbed my purse, feeling the heavy lump of the iron key resting at the bottom, and walked out to my car. I drove toward the edge of St. Martinville, leaving the familiar suburban streets for the older, quieter sections of the parish. The Catholic parish hall sat at the end of a long gravel driveway lined with towering ancient oaks. It was a beautiful, historic structure built of weathered red brick, featuring tall stained glass windows that caught the morning light. It looked peaceful, entirely removed from the chaotic financial warfare raging inside my home. I parked my car near the heavy wooden front doors, but did not immediately get out. The air conditioning hummed, fighting the relentless Louisiana heat. I reached into my purse to retrieve the key. My fingers brushed against the thick manila envelope Broussard had handed me at the diner. I pulled the envelope into my lap. I had signed the quitclaim deed and handed it back, but Broussard had left the envelope containing the key on the table. I opened the brass clasp and tilted the envelope, expecting the iron key to slide out into my palm. The key dropped, landing with a heavy clink on the center console. But it was not alone. A folded piece of thick, yellowed paper followed, fluttering down to rest on my thigh. I frowned, picking up the paper. It was not a brochure for the parish hall or a set of rules regarding the rental. It was a photocopy of an old bank ledger. The ink was faded, indicating the document had been printed decades ago. The header bore the insignia of a major regional bank in Lafayette. My archivist instincts kicked in. I scanned the columns of numbers, tracing the flow of financial transactions. The ledger detailed the outgoing wire transfers from a private trust account. I traced my finger down the page until I hit a highlighted row. The date on the transfer was 24 years ago, October 12th. My heart skipped a beat, a cold, creeping dread sinking into my stomach. October 12th was the exact day Mia was born. She arrived 2 months premature. The pregnancy had been a terrifying, complicated ordeal, ending in an emergency cesarean section at Our Lady of Lourdes, the regional Catholic hospital in Lafayette, where families from all over Acadiana went when the local clinics could not handle critical trauma. I looked at the recipient line on the ledger. The transfer was wired directly to the billing department of Our Lady of Lourdes. I moved my eyes to the far right column, reading the amount transferred. $60,000. The air inside my car suddenly felt too thin. I stared at the number, the faded ink burning into my retinas. $60,000 was the exact amount of the staggering medical debt Lucas and I had accrued during the 6 weeks Mia spent fighting for her life in the neonatal intensive care unit. We had no health insurance at the time. Lucas was a substitute teacher, and I was working part-time at a local library. We were facing absolute financial ruin. Then, miraculously, the hospital billing department called us into a small, sterile office and informed us an anonymous donor had settled the account in full. The administrator refused to disclose the name, claiming the benefactor demanded strict confidentiality. We spent years believing a local Catholic charity or a wealthy parishioner had intervened. We thanked God for the nameless angel who saved us from bankruptcy. I looked back at the top of the ledger, my hands beginning to tremble. The name of the private trust account funding the wire transfer was printed in stark, undeniable black ink. The Elias Thorne Family Trust. A visceral, suffocating flashback hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was 24 years old again, sitting in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital waiting room. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee filled my nose. I was holding a tiny, fragile newborn who weighed less than 3 pounds, terrified she was going to stop breathing. Lucas was sitting in the plastic chair next to me, his face buried in his hands. He was weeping, his broad shoulders shaking with the crushing weight of his fear and his perceived failure to provide for his family. I remembered him looking up at me, his eyes bloodshot, his voice cracking as he delivered the ultimate confirmation of his isolation. My dad didn't even call. Elias Thorne did not call his son. He did not visit the hospital to see his first grandchild. He maintained his terrifying, rigid pride, allowing Lucas to believe he had been entirely abandoned during the darkest moment of his life. But he paid the bill. He wired $60,000 to save his son from financial ruin, hiding his mercy behind an impenetrable wall of silence. The staggering weight of the truth crushed my lungs. For 25 years, I had built an entire identity around surviving the villainy of my father-in-law. I used his cruelty as a shield, blaming his oppressive shadow for every hardship we endured. I hated him with a fierce, protective passion, convinced he was a monster who delighted in our struggle. My entire narrative was based on his absolute malice. And now, sitting in the parking lot of the venue his estate manager had arranged, holding the proof of his secret salvation, the narrative shattered. The monster who filed the legal lien to block my credit was the same man who paid for the incubator that kept my daughter alive. I dropped the ledger onto the passenger seat. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. A wave of profound, disorienting panic surged through my chest. I could not process the duality of the man. If Elias was capable of this level of quiet grace, then my hatred was unjustified. And if my hatred was unjustified, then the cruel things I had screamed at Lucas about the Thorne bloodline were not just unfair, they were entirely wrong. My breathing grew shallow and rapid. I was hyperventilating. The tight, controlled archive of my mind was collapsing. I pulled my right fist back and slammed it violently into the center of the steering wheel. The car horn blared, a sharp, jarring noise that echoed across the empty gravel lot. I hit the wheel again, gasping for air, tears of frustration and overwhelming confusion blinding my vision. I pounded the leather surface until my hand ached, desperate to physically release the pressure building in my skull. I had spent 2 decades convinced I was the righteous protector of my family, shielding them from a villain. Now I realized the villain had secretly provided the armor. I slumped back against the driver's seat, wiping the tears from my face with trembling hands. Broussard had left this ledger in the envelope intentionally. It was not a mistake. He wanted me to see the truth. He wanted me to understand the complexity of the Thorne estate before I executed my next move. He was playing a dangerous, calculated game of chess, and he had just handed me a piece that changed the entire board. I picked up the yellowed ledger, folding it carefully, and slipped it into the zippered compartment of my purse. I could not show this to Lucas, not today. He was already reeling from my outburst and the loss of the wedding venue. If I handed him proof that his father had secretly saved Mia's life, it would shatter his fragile emotional state entirely. It would force him to confront the ghost he had spent 25 years trying to bury. I had to carry this secret alone. I had to walk into that parish hall, inspect the floors, and prepare a reception for a wedding that was only happening because I had traded my inheritance to the man who served our greatest enemy. The silent war had evolved into a terrifying psychological maze, and I was navigating it completely blind. I grabbed the iron key, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the heavy wooden doors, unaware that the darkest truth of my own bloodline was still waiting to be unearthed. I did not go inside the parish hall. I could not bring myself to turn the heavy iron key in the lock. The revelation of the neonatal medical bill had severely compromised my trust in Broussard's intentions. The estate manager had presented the venue as a clean trade for my father's land, but the inclusion of the old bank ledger felt like a manipulative maneuver. He was feeding me pieces of the past to guide my actions in the present. If he was willing to utilize a 24-year-old secret to secure my signature on a quitclaim deed, I needed to know exactly what I had signed away. I drove straight from St. Martinville back to the Historical Society. The afternoon heat was oppressive, radiating off the asphalt in shimmering waves. I limped into the archives, the broken heel of my shoe a constant reminder of my impulsive anger. Valerie was absent from the front desk, likely taking an early lunch. The building was quiet, the silence offering a stark contrast to the roaring confusion in my mind. I sat at my administrative terminal and pulled the copy of the quitclaim deed from my tote bag. I had signed it in the diner, blinded by desperation, focused entirely on saving Mia's wedding reception. Now, with the adrenaline faded, I applied my professional scrutiny to the document. I traced the legal jargon, examining the specific entity Broussard had listed as the recipient of the transfer. It was an administrative holding company, a limited liability corporation registered in Baton Rouge. I cross-referenced the corporate ID number through the state registry. The holding company did not belong to Elias Thorne. It was entirely independent, managed exclusively by Broussard. A cold prickle of alarm traveled down my spine. Broussard had not secured the land for the Thorne estate to end the boundary dispute. He had manipulated me into transferring the parcel directly into his personal control, bypassing Elias's corporate lawyers entirely. Why would an estate manager go to such lengths to acquire 15 acres of useless, undeveloped marshland? I dug deeper. My father was a swindler who flipped land, but he never held on to property unless it served a specific, usually deceptive purpose. I accessed the historical environmental surveys for the region. The Louisiana sugarcane industry is the economic lifeblood of Acadiana, but it carries a dark, toxic underbelly. Decades of aggressive farming required immense volumes of harsh pesticides and chemical fertilizers. Managing the runoff was expensive, and agricultural titans often sought cheaper, less regulated methods of disposal. I pulled the soil and water quality reports from the 1980s, cross-referencing the coordinates of my father's 15-acre tract. The digital archives loaded slowly, the spinning wheel testing my fragile patience. The screen finally populated a dense, scanned document from the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. I read the summary, and the blood drained from my face. The report detailed a catastrophic ecological hazard. During the late 1980s, my father had leased the 15 acres to several mid-tier sugarcane operators as an unregulated dumping ground. He allowed them to bury hundreds of barrels of toxic pesticide runoff and chemical sludge deep in the marsh mud, far away from the prying eyes of state inspectors. He collected cash payments for the illegal disposal and then conveniently forgot the land existed, leaving the poison to seep into the groundwater. My eyes darted to the most recent addendum attached to the file, time-stamped just 2 months ago. The EPA had discovered the illegal dumping site. They were in the final stages of preparing a devastating punitive action. The federal agency was gearing up to levy catastrophic environmental fines against the current legal owner of the property. The penalties calculated in the report were staggering, reaching well into the millions. It was enough debt to instantly bankrupt a working-class family and seize all their remaining assets. I owned the land. My father had passed the title to me. The EPA was preparing to drop a nuclear financial bomb on my household. I sat frozen, the glow of the monitor illuminating the horrifying reality of my inheritance. Then, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place, and the realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Elias Thorne did not file the legal lien to block my credit or ruin Mia's wedding. He filed the boundary dispute to legally tie the toxic marshland to the Thorne agricultural empire. He was using his expensive Baton Rouge corporate lawyers to aggressively claim ownership of the parcel before the EPA could finalize their investigation. Elias was stepping into the line of fire. He possessed the corporate wealth and the legal shielding to absorb the massive federal fines without losing his estate. The monster I had spent my entire adult life hating was not punishing Lucas. He was throwing himself on a financial grenade to shield his son from the devastating consequences of my father's corruption. My breath caught in my throat. The narrative I had fiercely protected for 25 years shattered completely. I had built a fortress of self-righteousness, convincing myself that I was the noble, working-class protector, defending my husband from his cruel elite family. I had used Elias's reputation as a weapon, screaming at Lucas just this morning that Thorn men ruin everything they touch. But my father was the true villain. My bloodline was the source of the poison. And Broussard knew it. The estate manager had discovered the incoming EPA fines and recognized the threat they posed to the Thorn empire. If Elias absorbed the penalty, the estate's liquidity would suffer. So Broussard orchestrated a shadow negotiation. He offered me the parish hall in exchange for the quitclaim deed. Intending to transfer the toxic land back to my name through a shell corporation, just before the EPA dropped the hammer. He was willing to let the federal government destroy my family to protect the Thorn assets from Elias's secret act of mercy. The sheer magnitude of my misplaced hatred and the reality of Broussard's betrayal crashed over me. A wave of intense physical nausea rolled through my stomach. I pushed my chair back, the wheels screeching against the linoleum floor. I stumbled toward the small kitchenette attached to the archive room. I barely made it to the plastic trash can before my stomach heaved. I gripped the edges of the counter, vomiting violently into the bin, my body physically rejecting the toxic truth of my own existence. I stood there for several minutes, gasping for air, the sour taste of bile burning the back of my throat. I wiped my mouth with a paper towel, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I was a fool. I was an arrogant, blind fool who had traded away the very shield Elias had built to protect us. By signing that quitclaim deed and handing it to Broussard, I had walked directly into his trap. I splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the small mirror above the sink. My eyes were red-rimmed, my face pale and drawn. I had almost destroyed my marriage this morning over a lie. I had to fix this. I could not let Broussard file that deed. I could not let the EPA fines annihilate the life Lucas and I had built. I walked back to my terminal and stared at the EPA report. The panic slowly receded, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. Broussard thought he was dealing with an ignorant, desperate mother willing to sign anything for a wedding venue. He did not realize he was dealing with an archivist. I knew the parish property laws better than any corporate lawyer in Baton Rouge. I knew the archaic, convoluted codes that governed land transfers in Acadiana. Broussard had the quitclaim deed, but Louisiana law requires a specific chain of administrative validation before a transfer of contested environmental land can be finalized. He needed one more signature from the parish clerk to ratify the Shell Corporation's acquisition. I reached for my phone, my fingers flying across the screen. I needed to access the century-old zoning loopholes buried deep in the physical vaults of the Historical Society. I was going to intercept the deed. I was going to restructure the transfer, utilizing the archaic parish codes to permanently tether the toxic parcel and the impending federal fines directly to Broussard's personal LLC. I was not going to be a victim of my father's crimes, and I was not going to let Broussard destroy the man who had secretly saved my daughter's life. The silent war had shifted. I was no longer fighting Elias Thorn. I was fighting to protect him, and I was preparing to deploy the full weight of Louisiana history to trap a traitor. The sickness in my stomach settled into a hard, freezing block of adrenaline. I walked away from the kitchenette and returned to my terminal. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, staring at the glowing monitor. The EPA report regarding my father's toxic dumping site remained open on the screen, a ticking financial time bomb preparing to obliterate my family. Broussard held the signed quitclaim deed. He believed he had successfully maneuvered that bomb away from the Thorne estate and placed it squarely back into my lap. He underestimated my profession. I was an archivist in Acadiana. While Broussard spent his life managing sugarcane yields and intimidating tenant farmers, I spent my career deciphering the chaotic, ancient legal framework of Louisiana. Unlike the rest of the United States, which relies on English common law, Louisiana property statutes are rooted in the Napoleonic Code. It is a dense, archaic system of forced heirship, usufruct rights, and complex proxy laws designed centuries ago to protect French and Spanish land grants. It is a system built on loopholes, provided you know exactly which dusty ledger to open. I left the terminal and walked into the climate-controlled vault at the rear of the Historical Society. The air was cool and smelled of preserving chemicals and decaying leather. I navigated the tall, rolling shelves, moving past the Civil War records and the early 20th century census data. I stopped at a section dedicated to early agricultural land disputes from the 1920s. I pulled a heavy cloth-bound ledger from the shelf. I carried it to a reading table, flicking on the small brass lamp. I carefully turned the fragile, yellowed pages, scanning the handwritten French and English legal notations. I needed a mechanism to intercept Broussard's transfer. He planned to file the quitclaim deed using a shell corporation, acting as the administrative proxy to distance himself from the toxic liability. But the Napoleonic Code contains a very specific, rarely invoked clause regarding administrative proxies handling contested agricultural land facing federal or parish penalties. My finger traced the faded ink, stopping on a statute drafted in 1924. The clause stipulated that if an administrative proxy initiates a transfer of contested, penalized land without the express, notarized consent of the primary title holder, in this case, Elias Thorne, the liability for the penalties does not revert to the original owner. The liability transfers instantly and irreversibly to the personal assets of the proxy executing the filing. It was a primitive form of legal accountability designed to prevent corrupt land managers from dumping bad debts onto unsuspecting tenant farmers. It was the exact weapon I needed. I carried the heavy ledger back to the copier. I replicated the specific pages detailing the statute, ensuring the parish seal and the archival timestamps were clearly visible. I returned to my terminal and began drafting an addendum to the quitclaim deed. I structured the document with surgical precision. I invoked the 1924 statute, legally tethering the 15-acre toxic parcel and the entirety of the impending EPA environmental fines directly to Broussard's Personal Management Limited Liability Corporation. I crafted the language to ensure that the moment he filed the deed with the county clerk, he absorbed the catastrophic debt. I essentially rewired the bomb he built for me and placed the detonator in his own hand. I printed the addendum, my heart hammering a manila envelope, identical to the one Broussard had given me at the diner. I sealed the brass clasp. I checked my watch. It was nearing 4 in the afternoon. I knew Broussard's routine. He spent his late afternoons inspecting the eastern boundary of the Thorne estate before heading into town to file daily administrative paperwork before the county clerk's office closed at 5. I grabbed my purse, feeling the reassuring weight of the iron key to the parish hall at the bottom, and walked out to my car. I drove back toward Thibodeau's Grill, predicting Broussard would stop there for his usual afternoon coffee before hitting the courthouse. I parked my sedan across the street, keeping the diner's entrance in my line of sight. 10 minutes later, his polished silver truck pulled into the gravel lot. Broussard stepped out, wearing the same crisp plaid shirt and pragmatic boots. He looked confident. possessing the relaxed swagger of a man who believed he was holding all the cards. I waited until he walked inside, then crossed the street. I pushed the heavy glass door open, the bell jingling above me. The diner was less crowded than the previous night, smelling strongly of chicory and stale frying oil. I spotted Broussard sitting in his usual corner booth. He looked up as I approached, a flicker of surprise crossing his weathered face. "Gianna," he said, setting his coffee cup down, "I did not expect to see you again so soon. Is there a problem with the venue?" "No problem with the venue," I replied, sliding into the vinyl seat across from him. I forced my facial muscles to relax, crafting a mask of naive, exhausted gratitude. I projected the exact image he expected, a desperate, working-class mother relieved to have secured a location for her daughter's wedding. "I was actually on my way home," I lied smoothly, "but I realized I made a mistake last night when I signed the deed you gave me. I used blue ink instead of black. The parish clerks are notoriously strict about archival standards. I didn't want the filing rejected on a technicality and risk the venue agreement." I reached into my bag and pulled out the new, sealed manila envelope. I slid it across the scratched laminate table. "I reprinted the forms and signed them properly," I said, offering a warm, compliant smile. "I brought the original blue ink copy as well. You can shred it. I just wanted to make sure everything was perfect. I truly appreciate what you are doing for Mia." Broussard looked at the envelope, then back at me. His sharp eyes searched my face for any sign of deception, but he only saw a grateful, tired woman. His inherent arrogance blinded him to the trap. He believed he was the smartest person in the room, outmaneuvering both Elias's corporate lawyers and my family. He took the bait. Broussard picked up the envelope, testing its weight, before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "You are very thorough, Gianna," he said, returning the smile. "I will file this with the clerk before they close today. The boundary dispute will be officially dissolved, and the parish hall is yours for the weekend. Enjoy the wedding." "Well, thank you," I said, standing up from the booth. I walked out of the diner, maintaining my measured, limping pace until I reached my car. I climbed inside and locked the doors. I watched through the windshield as Broussard exited the diner a few minutes later, climbing into his silver truck. He pulled out of the lot, heading straight toward the center of town, driving directly toward the county clerk's office to file his own financial execution. I sat in the sweltering cabin of my sedan, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I should have felt relieved. I had protected my family from bankruptcy. I had neutralized a traitor who was attempting to destroy Elias Thorne. But as I watched his truck disappear down the highway, a dark, terrifying thrill coursed through my veins. It was not the righteous satisfaction of preserving justice. It was the cold, intoxicating rush of absolute vengeance. I had manipulated a man with the exact same ruthless precision my father used to swindle his clients. I had engineered a financial ruin, trapping a man in a legal cage he could not escape. I looked at my hands, trembling slightly against the leather wheel. I had spent 25 years despising the corrupt, powerful men who controlled this parish, judging their morality from my high horse. Now, sitting in the humid Louisiana heat, I wondered if I was simply becoming one of them to survive. The silence of the car felt oppressive. I had secured the venue and deflected the EPA fines, but the core fracture in my family remained untouched. I still possessed the 24-year-old bank ledger proving Elias saved Mia's life. I still carried the secret of my father's toxic dumping. And Lucas was still furious with me, retreating further into his own isolation. The wedding was tomorrow. The collision of these secrets was unavoidable. I started the engine, knowing I had to return home and face the husband I had lied to, preparing to dismantle the foundation of our marriage before our daughter walked down the aisle. The morning of Mia's wedding arrived not with sunlight, but with smoke. I stood in the gravel parking lot of the Catholic Parish Hall, holding a cardboard box filled with folded programs. The air in Acadiana was thick, carrying the unmistakable, cloying scent of burning sugar and charred vegetation. Late summer marks the beginning of the harvest preparation in St. Martin Parish. The local farmers set controlled fires to the massive sugarcane fields, a brutal but necessary agricultural ritual. The flames tear through the dense, towering stalks, incinerating the sharp, rotting outer leaves and the dense underbrush, leaving only the bare, sweet cane ready for the grinding mills. It is a violent purification process. The sky turns a hazy, bruised gray, and the sweet, acrid smoke drifts across the bayous, settling over the towns like a heavy blanket. I watched a dark plume rising in the distance, the symbolism pressing heavily against my chest. The farmers were burning away the rot to expose the truth underneath. I knew I had to do exactly the same thing today. I was carrying 25 years of toxic secrets. I held the iron key to a venue acquired through a shadow negotiation. I held the knowledge of my own father's corrupt environmental dumping, the very crime that almost bankrupted my family. I held the archaic, retaliatory deed I used to trap Broussard in financial ruin. But the heaviest burden was the faded bank ledger zipped inside my purse. The undeniable proof that Elias Thorne, the man I had blamed for every hardship we endured, was the anonymous donor who paid the staggering medical debt to save Mia's life. The weight of my deceit was suffocating. I had spent 2 days actively lying to my husband, allowing him to believe the venue was secured through a last-minute cancellation, while simultaneously harboring the truth about his father's secret mercy. The foundation of our marriage was built on the shared narrative of our survival against the cruel Thorne Empire. Revealing the ledger would incinerate that foundation completely. I tightened my grip on the cardboard box and walked toward the heavy wooden doors of the parish hall. I had to tell Lucas the truth. I had to burn the field. If I allowed Mia to walk down the aisle while this massive structural lie festered beneath us, the vows would feel hollow. The celebration would be a fraud. I pushed the doors open, stepping into the cool, air-conditioned vestibule. The parish hall was bustling with quiet, focused energy. My sister-in-law was directing a small team of local caterers, carrying trays of boudin balls and miniature crawfish pies toward the commercial kitchen. The florist, a woman I had known since high school, was arranging centerpieces of white magnolias and Spanish moss on the reception tables. The community had rallied around us after the initial venue collapsed, offering their labor and support to ensure Mia had a beautiful day. The generosity only deepened my crushing guilt. I found Lucas standing near the stained glass window in the small anteroom designated for the groomsmen. He was alone, facing a tall antique mirror, struggling with the knot of a silver silk tie. He wore a tailored charcoal suit we had purchased on clearance 3 years ago. The fabric pulled slightly across his broad shoulders, a physical reminder of the compromises we constantly made. But today, the exhaustion that usually lined his face was absent. I stepped into the room, setting the box of programs on a small wooden table. "Let me help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas turned, dropping his hands from the ruined knot. The stony silence that had defined our interactions since our explosive fight in the kitchen seemed to have dissolved overnight. He looked at me, his eyes bright with a profound, unburdened joy. It was an expression I had not seen on his face in years. The heavy, oppressive anxiety regarding the foreclosed barn, the frozen credit, and the looming financial disaster had lifted. He believed the crisis was averted. He believed we had survived the storm intact. I stepped closer, my fingers reaching up to untangle the silk fabric. The proximity was agonizing. I could smell the familiar, comforting scent of his aftershave, mixed with the faint odor of the sugarcane smoke drifting in from the open windows. "I cannot believe she is actually getting married today," Lucas murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He reached up, placing a warm hand over mine as I worked the tie. "I was so terrified we were going to let her down when that barn went bankrupt, Gianna. I felt like a complete failure, like I was dragging you both down. My hands froze against his collar. The raw vulnerability in his confession felt like a knife twisting in my ribs. He was carrying the guilt of a financial crisis he did not cause, blaming himself for a situation orchestrated by the sins of my own bloodline. "You are not a failure, Lucas," I said, my voice trembling. "You have always provided for us. You have always protected us." "We protect each other," he corrected softly, offering a genuine, deeply tender smile. "I know I was angry the other day about the letter. I know I shut down. But seeing this haul, seeing what you managed to pull together at the last second to save Mia's day, you are incredible, Gianna. You fought for our family when I was ready to give up. Thank you." The gratitude in his eyes was blinding. He was thanking me for a miracle I constructed entirely out of deception and manipulation. This was the moment. The fire in the cane fields outside was burning, demanding I reveal the rot hidden beneath our feet. I needed to pull the bank ledger from my purse. I needed to tell him that his father did not abandon him in the neonatal intensive care unit. I needed to confess that the man he spent 25 years avoiding had quietly absorbed a catastrophic federal fine to shield us from my father's crimes. I needed to admit that I traded our land to a traitor to acquire this very room. I opened my mouth, the words forming heavy and sharp on my tongue. But I looked at Lucas's face. I saw the pure, uncomplicated happiness radiating from him, the sheer relief of a father preparing to walk his healthy, beautiful daughter down the aisle without the shadow of his oppressive family looming over him. If I told him the truth right now, that joy would shatter instantly. The revelation of Elias's secret mercy would crack his worldview in half, plunging him into a chaotic, agonizing grief just minutes before the ceremony. It would destroy the peace he was currently resting on. My courage, the fierce determination I had built up in the parking lot, evaporated completely. The fear of ruining his happiness overpowered my need for honesty. I snapped my mouth shut, the toxic secrets sliding back down into my throat. I forced the corners of my mouth up, crafting a weak, trembling smile. I finished the knot on his tie, smoothing the silver silk against his chest. "You look handsome," I whispered, choosing the fragile, comfortable piece of a lie over the painful, destructive fire of the truth. "I will go check on Mia," I said, stepping back from his warmth, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of his gratitude. I turned and practically fled the anteroom, walking quickly down the carpeted hallway toward the bridal suite. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my sternum. I had taken the coward's way out. I preserved the illusion of our perfect united front, but the rot was still buried beneath us, ticking like a time bomb. I pushed open the door to the bridal suite. Mia was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by her bridesmaids, a vision of absolute radiance in her white lace gown. She turned toward me, her eyes shining with excitement, completely oblivious to the shadow war I was waging behind the scenes. The acoustic guitar player positioned in the main hall began to strum the opening chords of the processional music. The guests were taking their seats. The ceremony was starting. The point of no return had officially passed. I took a deep breath, pasting the fake smile firmly back onto my face, and prepared to watch my daughter walk down the aisle, terrified of the moment the carefully constructed floor beneath us would finally give way. The acoustic guitar player transitioned smoothly into a slow, traditional Akkadian melody. The parish hall fell silent, save for the rhythmic rattling of the large wooden ceiling fans struggling to circulate the dense, humid air. Even indoors, the Louisiana heat was inescapable. Our guests, a mix of fellow teachers, veterinary clinic staff, and working-class neighbors, sat in the wooden pews, folding their printed programs into makeshift fans. A few subtly swatted at the occasional mosquito that had slipped inside. It was not a glamorous country club wedding, but it was honest. grounded in the community that had sustained us for 25 years. I stood in the front row, smoothing the skirt of my simple navy dress. The bridal party processed down the aisle, finding their places near the altar. Then the music shifted, signaling the bride's entrance. The guests rose to their feet in a rustle of fabric. I turned my head to watch Mia step into the doorway at the back of the hall. Lucas was at her side, his arm linked through hers. The pride radiating from his face was blinding. Mia looked breathtaking, her white lace gown catching the muted light filtering through the stained glass windows. This was the moment I had sacrificed my father's land and lied to my husband to protect. They took 2 steps down the central aisle. And then the heavy iron-hinged doors at the very rear of the parish hall groaned open. The sound was not loud, but it cut through the acoustic guitar music like a gunshot. The doors were supposed to remain shut until the recessional. Several guests in the back rows turned their heads, their folded paper fans pausing mid-wave. I looked past Mia and Lucas, my eyes focusing on the shadowed vestibule. A figure stepped out of the bright afternoon glare and into the dim light of the hall. My heart slammed against my ribs, the blood turning to ice in my veins. Elias Thorne stood in the doorway. He was not wearing the sharp, tailored linen suits of a sugarcane baron. He wore a slightly rumpled dark jacket that hung too loose over his thinning shoulders. He leaned heavily on his wooden cane, his knuckles white with the effort of supporting his own weight. The corporate lawyers from Baton Rouge had explicitly ordered him to remain on the estate, managing his declining health and protecting the assets from the impending EPA fallout. They had legally isolated him, treating him as a liability to his own fortune. But Elias had defied them. He had driven himself off the property, navigating the smoke-filled parish roads to reach this vacant Catholic hall. The Titan of St. Martin Parish looked entirely out of place among the folding chairs and community-catered food. Stripped of his power, a fragile ghost haunting the edges of a life he had been forbidden to share. His pale, washed-out eyes scanned the room, bypassing the staring guests and locking directly onto Mia. The intensity of his gaze was staggering. He was not looking at her with judgment or malice. He was looking at his only granddaughter with a desperate, starving hunger. A ripple of uneasy whispers began to spread through the back pews. Some of the older guests recognized him. They knew the history of the Thorne family fracture. They knew the man standing in the doorway was the villain of our story. A groomsman, a burly paramedic who worked with Mia's fiancé, stepped out from the back row. He squared his shoulders, assessing Elias as a threat to the ceremony, and moved to intercept the uninvited guest. He intended to physically block Elias and escort him back out into the heat. The protective reflex in my chest surged, fueled by the terrifying knowledge resting in my purse. The man shuffling into the room was not a threat to Mia. He was the anonymous donor who had paid $60,000 to keep her breathing in an incubator. He was the secret shield absorbing the catastrophic federal fines generated by my father's corruption. If the groomsmen forcefully ejected Elias now, the public humiliation would crush a man who was already crumbling. I abandoned my place in the front row. I pushed past my sister-in-law, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, moving faster than social decorum allowed. I intercepted the groomsman just as he reached the back of the hall. I grabbed his broad shoulder, my fingers digging into the fabric of his suit jacket. "Stand down," I whispered, my voice a harsh, frantic hiss. The groomsman frowned, leaning down slightly. "Mrs. Thorne, that man isn't supposed to be here. I can get him out before he causes a scene." "Do not touch him," I commanded, my grip tightening until the fabric pulled taut. "Let him stay. Go back to your seat. Now." The groomsman looked confused by my fierce defense of the enemy, but he nodded, stepping back into the pew. I turned toward Elias. He stood just a few feet away, leaning heavily on the cane, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. He did not look at me. He did not acknowledge my intervention. His eyes remained locked on Mia, who had paused halfway down the aisle, her smile faltering as she noticed the commotion at the back of the room. I stepped backward, retreating to my spot in the front row, trying to minimize the disruption. The guests slowly turned their attention back to the bride. The acoustic guitar player, blessedly professional, slightly increased his volume to cover the lingering whispers. Mia resumed her walk, Lucas guiding her forward. Lucas's eyes were fixed on the altar, entirely focused on giving his daughter away. He had not seen his father enter. He did not know the architect of his lifelong trauma was standing in the shadows behind him. Lucas handed Mia over to her fiancé, kissing her cheek before stepping back to stand beside me. The priest began the opening prayer. The ceremony was underway. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my husband, but my mind was entirely detached from the vows being spoken. The air in the parish hall felt suffocatingly thin. Elias was here. He was breathing the same air as the son he had disowned 25 years ago. The psychological pressure cooker I had built by hiding the bank ledger and the EPA reports was rapidly approaching its boiling point. I reached out and grabbed Lucas's arm. I needed physical grounding to stop my knees from shaking. My fingers clamped down on his forearm, finding the space just above his wrist. I squeezed. The tension radiating through my body channeled directly into my grip. I stared straight ahead at the altar, my vision blurring, my mind racing through catastrophic scenarios. What if Elias collapsed during the ring exchange? What if Lucas turned around and saw the man he despised ruining his daughter's perfect moment? What if Broussard arrived and attempted to physically drag Elias out of the hall, triggering a violent confrontation? I squeezed harder, the acrylic nails of my right hand biting sharply into the fabric of Lucas's suit sleeve, pressing deep into the skin underneath. Lucas flinched. He glanced down at my hand, then looked at my profile. His expression shifted from quiet joy to immediate concern. He could feel the chaotic, vibrating energy pouring off me. He gently placed his other hand over mine, trying to loosen my painful grip. "Gianna," he whispered, leaning in close, his breath warm against my ear. "Are you okay? You are shaking." I could not look at him. If I met his eyes, the dam would break. I would confess everything right there in the front row while the priest recited Corinthians. I kept my gaze locked on the stained glass window behind the altar, my jaw clamped shut, my nails remaining dug into his arm. "I am fine," I lied through clenched teeth, a single drop of sweat tracing a cold path down my spine. "Just emotional." He accepted the lie, returning his attention to the ceremony, his hand resting gently over mine, unaware that he was comforting the architect of his impending devastation. The vows concluded, the rings were exchanged, the priest pronounced them husband and wife, and the room erupted into cheers. The tension broke, replaced by a wave of loud, celebratory applause. Mia and her new husband turned, walking back up the aisle, radiant and triumphant. Lucas clapped loudly beside me, turning his body toward the center aisle to watch his daughter process out. As Mia passed the final rows of pews, Lucas's gaze naturally followed her toward the exit doors. The applause in our section of the front row died instantly. I watched Lucas's hand stop moving. His posture went completely rigid. The color vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The joyful smile he had worn for the past hour melted off his features, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He was staring directly at the shadowed vestibule. He had finally seen his father. Elias stood near the exit, leaning on his cane, watching his son through the crowd of cheering guests. The 25-year wall of silence between them had just been breached. The collision was inevitable, and I was standing directly in the blast radius, armed with secrets that were about to incinerate the fragile piece of our entire family. The transition from the solemn quiet of the ceremony to the chaotic energy of an Acadian reception is always jarring. but today it felt like stepping off a cliff. The caterers pushed aside the wooden pews, clearing a large space in the center of the hall. The acoustic guitar player was replaced by a 5-piece brass band from Lafayette. The trumpeter raised his instrument, blasting the opening notes of a traditional second line. It is a staple of Louisiana weddings, a loud, joyful parade where the bride and groom lead the guests around the dance floor, everyone waving white handkerchiefs in the air. The music is designed to shake the dust from the rafters and command absolute celebration. The crowd erupted. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the humid air. The joy in the room was infectious, a tangible, vibrant force generated by a community of working-class people determined to celebrate despite the stifling heat and the modest surroundings. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, gripping a white handkerchief, but my feet remained rooted to the floorboards. I was trapped inside a psychological pressure cooker, the brass music pounding against my skull like a warning siren. I watched Lucas. He was standing near the makeshift bar setup, holding a plastic cup of beer, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the room. The shock of seeing his father in the vestibule had faded into a tense, wary vigilance. Lucas was hunting. He expected Elias to make a move. He expected the man who had disinherited him to march to the center of the room, demand attention, and ruin the reception with a cruel, public display of dominance. That was the Elias Thorne we knew. That was the monster Lucas had braced himself to fight. But Elias was not fighting. I tracked Lucas's gaze as he finally located his father. Elias was sitting at a small, shadowed table in the very back corner of the hall, far away from the blaring trumpets and the spinning dancers. The corporate lawyers in Baton Rouge had tried to lock him away, treating him like a fragile liability to the Thorne estate. Sitting in that folding chair, he looked exactly like the liability they feared. He was slouched forward, both hands resting on the curved handle of his wooden cane. I held my breath, waiting for Lucas to explode. I waited for my husband to drop his plastic cup, storm across the dance floor, and demand that the man who had ignored our daughter's existence for 2 decades leave the premises immediately. I braced myself to physically intervene, terrified that a confrontation would force me to reveal the bank ledger to stop Lucas from attacking the man who had secretly saved Mia's life. The confrontation never came. Lucas stared at the shadowed corner for a long, agonizing minute. The tension in his shoulders, the aggressive, defensive posture he had adopted since spotting Elias in the vestibule, simply dissolved. His shoulders slumped. The anger drained out of his posture, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep sorrow. He looked at the frail, isolated old man sitting alone while 100 people danced and celebrated. Lucas shook his head, a slow, mournful movement, accepting the tragic reality of his father's chosen exile. He turned his back on the corner table, walked to the bar, and ordered a whiskey. He chose not to fight. He chose to let the ghost remain a ghost. I exhaled a shaky breath, the relief mixing toxically with my guilt. The immediate crisis was averted, but the ticking time bomb remained seated in the back of the room. I needed to blunt the edges of my anxiety. I walked to the opposite end of the bar, avoiding Lucas's line of sight, and ordered a glass of white wine. I drank it in 3 long swallows. The cheap, acidic liquid burned the back of my throat. I set the empty plastic cup on the counter and immediately ordered a second. I drank that one just as fast, the alcohol hitting my empty stomach, sending a warm, numbing wave through my chest. I ordered a third, carrying it with me as I retreated to the edge of the dance floor. I was using the alcohol cowardly, seeking a chemical shield to protect myself from the catastrophic secrets I was carrying. The wine softened the sharp edges of my panic, but it also lowered my inhibitions. I looked across the room at Elias. He was watching the second line parade spin around the floor. His pale eyes tracked Mia as she laughed, waving her handkerchief, surrounded by bridesmaids and groomsmen who loved her fiercely. He watched Lucas standing by the bar, joking with the paramedics Mia worked with, sharing an easy, unforced camaraderie. Elias was observing the vibrant, grounded family Lucas had built, entirely without Thorn money. He was watching a wealth of human connection that his vast agricultural empire could never purchase. The sheer isolation radiating from the old man was staggering. The wine humming in my bloodstream pushed me forward. I needed to gauge the threat. I needed to know if Elias was lucid enough to understand where he was, or if the cognitive decline Broussard warned me about had triggered a hostile, unpredictable confusion. I picked up a fresh, condensation-covered glass of ice water from a tray near the catering station. I walked around the perimeter of the dance floor, dodging the spinning couples and the blaring brass instruments, navigating the humid, crowded room until I reached the shadowed corner. I stopped beside his table. The air here felt different, heavy with a silent, oppressive grief. I set the glass of ice water down on the table, pushing it gently toward him. It was a test, a subtle probe to see if the Titan would sneer at my offering, if he would slap the glass away and hurl insults about my father's corrupt bloodline. I waited for the venom. I waited for the cruel patriarch of St. Martin Parish to reassert his dominance. Elias slowly lifted his head. The pale blue eyes that had glared at me with such terrifying authority on his veranda just days ago were dull, clouded with exhaustion. He looked at the glass of water, then up at my face. He did not sneer. He did not issue a command. He lifted his right hand from the handle of his cane. The tremor in his fingers was severe, a visible manifestation of his failing physical strength. He reached out and wrapped his shaking hand around the cold glass. "Thank you, Gianna," he rasped. His voice was barely audible over the sound of the trumpets, rough and fractured. The simple expression of gratitude hit me harder than a physical blow. The monster I had hated for 25 years, the villain who had fueled my self-righteous anger and justified my manipulative tactics with Broussard, was gone. The man sitting in front of me was just an old, lonely father who had broken out of a corporate cage to catch a fleeting glimpse of the family he had driven away. I took a step back, the alcohol in my system failing to suppress the crushing wave of empathy that washed over me. The simplicity of his vulnerability was devastating. I had spent days acting like a ruthless tactician, using archival loopholes and secret ledgers to outmaneuver the Thorn Empire, preparing to deploy Louisiana law to protect my family from this man. But looking at Elias now, drinking the water with shaking hands, I realized the war was over. The enemy had surrendered. The only casualties left to inflict were the ones I would cause if the secrets I was hiding came to light. I turned away from the table, retreating into the crowd, desperate to put distance between myself and the heartbreaking reality of his decline. I needed to find Lucas. I needed to convince him to take Mia and leave the reception early, before the fragile peace in the room shattered. But as I pushed my way through the sweating, laughing guests, the brass band abruptly ceased playing. The sudden silence was jarring, leaving a ringing echo in the large hall. A sharp squeal of microphone feedback cut through the air. I looked toward the front of the room. The best man had finished his speech and was handing the microphone to the bride. Mia stood near the head table, the lace of her gown stained with sweat from dancing. Her cheeks were flushed, her breathing slightly elevated, but her eyes were fixed on the shadowed corner at the back of the room. She was staring directly at Elias Thorn. My stomach plummeted. The alcohol in my veins turned to ice. The ticking time bomb had not been diffused. It had just been handed a microphone. The sharp squeal of feedback from the microphone sliced through the humid air of the parish hall. The festive energy that had been thrumming through the crowd just moments ago vanished, replaced by an expectant, uncomfortable silence. The 5 members of the brass band stood awkwardly in the corner, lowering their trumpets and trombones, unsure of what was happening. The sudden quiet exposed the rattling of the ceiling fans and the distant drone of cicadas outside the open windows. I stood frozen near the edge of the dance floor, my empty wine cup crushed in my hand. Mia gripped the microphone stand with both hands. The exhaustion on her face was profound. The stress of the venue bankruptcy, the frantic scramble to secure this parish hall, and the suffocating tension she had sensed between Lucas and me all morning had clearly pushed her to the breaking point. She was running on adrenaline and raw emotion. Her gaze was locked onto the shadowed corner where Elias sat hunched over his cane. "I was supposed to read a toast right now," Mia began, her voice carrying a brittle, shaking edge that echoed off the brick walls. "I had this whole speech planned about how grateful I am for the caterers and the band and for my parents scraping together pennies so I could have a beautiful dress." She paused, taking a ragged breath. The silence in the room thickened. Guests shifted uneasily in their wooden folding chairs. Lucas, standing a few feet away from the head table, frowned, his protective instincts flaring as he recognized the dangerous tremor in his daughter's voice. "But I cannot stand here and pretend everything is fine," Mia continued, her grip on the microphone tightening. "Not when the ghost that has haunted my family my entire life is sitting in the back row." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Dozens of heads turned, following Mia's gaze toward the dim corner. The older guests, the ones who knew the history of the Thorne family fracture, exchanged wide-eyed, horrified glances. Lucas stiffened, his jaw clenching as the reality of his father's presence was dragged into the unforgiving light. I felt a cold sweat break across my forehead. The wine in my system turned to acid. Mia was snapping. The inherited resentment she had watched her parents carry for 2 decades was boiling over, hijacking her celebration. Mia reached toward the head table. My leather purse sat next to the floral centerpiece. I had left it there when the second line parade started, thinking the contents were secure. Mia plunged her hand into the open bag. My heart stalled in my chest. I knew exactly what she was reaching for. I had taken the 25-year-old letter of disinheritance, the cruel, venomous manifesto Elias had written to Lucas, and slipped it into my purse that morning. I planned to use it as a reminder, a talisman of anger to keep my courage up while I confessed the truth about the EPA fines and the venue trade. I had forgotten to remove it. Mia pulled the thick, cream-colored stationery from my bag. She unfolded it, the embossed Thorne agricultural crest catching the light. "The richest thing I own is this piece of paper," Mia announced, her voice rising in volume, echoing with a fierce, vindictive clarity. "I found it in my mother's purse this morning while I was looking for tissues. It was written 25 years ago by the man sitting by the exit." Lucas stepped forward, raising a hand. "Mia, sweetheart, stop. Put that away. Not today." "No, Dad," Mia shot back, tears of anger shining in her eyes. "You have protected him for too long. You let his silence dictate our lives. He came here today to watch us. He needs to hear exactly what he built." She raised the letter, holding it close to the microphone. I panicked. The terror gripping me was absolute. If Elias had been the ruthless titan I imagined, this public exposure would be a satisfying, righteous execution. But I had seen him drinking water with trembling hands just 5 minutes ago. I knew about his cognitive decline. More importantly, I knew the truth. I knew Elias had secretly absorbed a catastrophic federal fine to shield Lucas from my father's corruption. I knew Elias was the anonymous donor who wired $60,000 to save Mia's life in the neonatal intensive care unit. This public shaming was unjust. It was a horrific, misdirected execution based on a lie I had perpetuated. If Mia read those cruel words aloud to a room full of people, the humiliation would crush a fragile old man who had sacrificed his own reputation to protect us. It might literally induce a heart attack. I dropped the crushed plastic cup. I had to stop her. I lunged forward, pushing past a group of startled guests, my eyes locked on the microphone stand. I needed to rip the paper from her hands before she could speak the words. I ask you to think about this moment. Have you ever let anger hijack a celebration, tearing down the very people you love in a desperate bid for justice? Drop your thoughts below. I moved too fast. The alcohol buzzing in my bloodstream wrecked my coordination. I navigated the tight space between the dance floor and the head table, my focus entirely consumed by the letter in Mia's hand. I did not see the wooden leg of the heavy catering table protruding into the aisle. My foot caught the solid oak leg mid-stride. My forward momentum betrayed me. I pitched forward, the world tilting wildly out of focus. I threw my hands out to brace for the impact. I crashed hard onto the hardwood floor. My knees slammed into the polished planks with a sickening crack. The impact sent a shockwave of white-hot pain shooting up my thighs, instantly stealing the breath from my lungs. I slid a few inches, my palms skidding against the wood, tearing the skin. I collapsed in a heap of navy fabric, sprawled directly in front of the head table. The entire parish hall gasped. A chorus of alarmed shouts erupted from the guests. Lucas shouted my name, rushing forward to grab my shoulders. "Gianna!" he cried, dropping to his knees beside me, his hands frantically checking for injuries. "Are you okay? Do not move." I ignored the searing pain in my legs. I ignored my husband's terrified face. I pushed myself up onto my scraped palms, twisting my head to look up at the stage. "Mia, do not read it!" I gasped, my voice a ragged, desperate plea. "Please, put it down!" But the chaos of my fall only amplified the tension in the room. Mia looked down at me, horrified by my sudden collapse, but the adrenaline surging through her system blocked out my warning. She believed I had tripped trying to protect Lucas from embarrassment. She believed she was performing an act of righteous defense for her parents. She tightened her grip on the microphone. Her voice rang out, shaking but incredibly loud, cutting over the concerned murmurs of the crowd. She read the first line. "To my son," Mia read, quoting Elias's jagged handwriting, "You have chosen to pollute this family line with the blood of a common thief. By marrying Gianna, you are infecting the Thorne legacy with deceit." I closed my eyes, a sob tearing at my throat. The words I had hidden for decades were now echoing off the stained glass windows, exposing the darkest fracture of our family to the entire community. "I strip you of my name," Mia continued, the venom of the 25-year-old letter dripping from her tongue. "Without the Thorne fortune, you will fail at everything you attempt. You will spend your life scraping by on pennies, drowning in the mediocrity of a working-class existence. You will die with nothing to show for your life but the burden of a parasitic wife." She finished the paragraph. The silence that followed was absolute. The festive Acadian joy had evaporated entirely, sucked out of the room and replaced by a suffocating, horrified tension. No one moved. No one spoke. The guests sat paralyzed, staring at the bride holding the damning evidence of a grandfather's cruelty. I knelt on the hardwood floor, my knees throbbing, the tears streaming freely down my face. I had failed. I had allowed the fire in the cane fields to burn out of control, incinerating the fragile peace I had sacrificed everything to protect. The truth was out, but it was the wrong truth, and the damage it was about to inflict on the fragile old man sitting in the shadows would be irreversible. I remained on my knees on the hardwood floor, the throbbing pain in my legs overshadowed by the blinding panic gripping my chest. Lucas kept his hands on my shoulders, his face a mask of shock and confusion as the cruel words of his father's letter echoed through the quiet hall. The guests stared at the stage, paralyzed by the sheer brutality of the 25-year-old manifesto. I expected the room to erupt into whispers. I expected Mia to throw the letter to the floor and storm out of the reception, destroying the wedding day entirely. But Mia did not move. She stood at the microphone, the heavy, cream-colored stationery trembling slightly in her hand. The furious adrenaline that had fueled her reading seemed to evaporate. She looked down at the paper, then lifted her chin, scanning the sea of horrified faces until her gaze locked onto the shadowed corner near the exit. She stared directly at Elias Thorne. He was wrong, Mia stated. Her voice was no longer shaking with anger. It carried a profound, steady clarity that demanded absolute attention. Lucas flinched beside me, his grip on my shoulder tightening. My father did not fail, Mia continued, her words ringing out over the quiet hum of the ceiling fans. He spent 25 years teaching history, working extra shifts, and fixing broken cars so I could go to college. He built a life completely without the Thorne fortune, and we never starved. We are the wealthiest family in this parish because we have each other. She slowly lowered the letter, resting her hand on the microphone stand. The anger in her eyes dissolved, replaced by an expression of profound, devastating empathy. And to the man who wrote this, Mia said, her voice dropping to a softer, almost reverent pitch. To the man sitting in the back row, my heart stalled. I gripped Lucas's suit sleeve, terror icing my veins. Thank you, Mia whispered into the microphone. Thank you for paying my NICU bills 24 years ago. A collective, jagged gasp rippled through the guests. I found the ledger, Mia explained, the tears returning to her eyes, tracing slow paths down her cheeks. I found it in my mother's car yesterday while I was looking for a phone charger. I saw the date. I saw the transfer amount. I know it was you. You saved my life. The silence that fell over the parish hall was heavier than the humid Louisiana air pressing against the stained glass windows. The revelation dropped like an anvil, shattering the narrative of the cruel, heartless patriarch that had defined our family for 2 decades. The guests, many of whom had known Lucas since he was a teenager, sat frozen, processing the staggering contradiction of a man who would write a letter of pure hatred and then secretly pay $60,000 to save the child he refused to acknowledge. Lucas stopped breathing. His hands fell away from my shoulders. He stood up, slowly, as if moving through deep water. He stared at Mia, his brow furrowed, his mind struggling to integrate the impossible information. He had spent his entire adult life believing his father had abandoned him in the sterile waiting room of Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital. He had carried the agonizing weight of that rejection, allowing it to define his self-worth. Lucas slowly turned his head, pivoting his body away from the stage. He looked past the stunned faces of his friends and neighbors, aiming his gaze directly at the back corner of the hall. Elias Thorne sat in the folding chair, entirely exposed. The corporate lawyers from Baton Rouge had tried to isolate him, treating him as a fragile liability to the agricultural empire. They had ordered him to stay hidden on the estate, managing his declining memory behind locked gates. But sitting in the parish hall, stripped of his wealth and his intimidating authority, Elias looked undeniably human. He stared back at his son. The 25-year wall of silence between them finally collapsed. Elias did not sneer. He did not issue a command or attempt to reassert his dominance. The immovable titan of St. Martin Parish, the man who had terrified tenant farmers and commanded millions in sugarcane revenue, simply shattered. His right hand slipped from the curved handle of his wooden cane. The cane clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, rolling a few inches away. Elias raised both of his trembling, liver-spotted hands and covered his face. He began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified tear slipping down a stoic cheek. It was a messy, ugly, chest-heaving sob. The sound of his crying was guttural, torn from deep within his lungs, a sound of profound, agonizing grief breaking free after a quarter-century of stubborn pride. His thin shoulders shook violently with each sob. He cried for the years he had lost, for the son he had driven away, and for the agonizing isolation he had built around himself. The sound of his weeping echoed through the silent hall, piercing the hearts of everyone watching. Lucas took a step forward, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. He raised his hand, reaching out toward the father he had not spoken to since he was a young man. But Elias could not bear the exposure. The raw vulnerability of weeping in front of the working-class community he had once despised was too much for his fractured pride to endure. He lowered his hands, his face slick with tears, his breath catching in ragged gasps. He did not reach down to retrieve his fallen cane. He pushed himself up from the folding chair, relying heavily on the table for balance. Elias turned away from his son. He shoved the heavy rear doors open, stumbling out of the parish hall and into the dark, humid Louisiana night. The doors swung shut behind him, cutting off the view of his retreat. The only sound left in the room was the relentless, rhythmic droning of the cicadas drifting in through the open windows, filling the stunned quiet left in his wake. I remained on the floor, the pain in my knees entirely forgotten. I stared at the closed doors, the reality of the situation crashing over me. The secret was out. Mia had discovered the ledger and chosen to deploy it not as a weapon of destruction, but as an instrument of grace. She had burned the field, exposing the truth I had been too cowardly to confess. But my relief was short-lived. The ledger was only one piece of the puzzle. The revelation of the medical bill had shattered the narrative of Elias the monster, but it did not explain the current crisis. It did not explain the legal lien freezing our credit. It did not explain the quitclaim deed I had signed to acquire this venue. I looked up at Lucas. He was standing motionless in the center aisle, staring at the doors his father had just disappeared through. The sorrow etched into his features was devastating. He was processing a lifetime of misplaced grief, grappling with the realization that the man he hated had secretly protected him. I knew the peace would not last. The foundation of our marriage was still resting on a fault line of my own making. When the shock of the ledger wore off, Lucas would realize the timeline did not make sense. He would realize that if Elias was a secret protector 24 years ago, the sudden legal attack on my marshland this week defied logic. The questions would start, and when they did, I would have to confess the darkest secret of all. I would have to admit that my own father's corrupt environmental dumping was the source of our impending financial ruin. I would have to explain how I negotiated with Broussard, risking our family's future to secure a wedding venue. The catharsis of Elias's breakdown had cleared the air, but the storm was far from over. I pushed myself up from the floor, my scraped palms stinging, preparing to face the man I loved and tear down the final remnants of the lies keeping our family together. The rest of the wedding reception dissolved into a muted, surreal blur. The festive energy never truly recovered after Elias hobbled out the back doors. The band played softer, slower tunes. Guests spoke in hushed, reverent whispers, processing the emotional detonation they had just witnessed. Mia spent the remainder of the evening dancing close to her new husband, her face radiant but exhausted. The heavy burden of the inherited resentment finally lifted from her shoulders. I helped clean the parish hall, stacking folding chairs and sweeping the hardwood floors, moving mechanically to avoid looking at Lucas. He functioned on autopilot, shaking hands and thanking guests for attending, but his eyes were distant. He was trapped in his own head, navigating the ruins of a 25-year-old narrative. We drove home in silence. The Louisiana night was oppressive, the air thick with the smell of the smoldering cane fields. At 2 a.m, our small house was suffocatingly quiet. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan ticking overhead. Lucas sat on the edge of the mattress, fully dressed, his hands resting on his knees. "He left his cane," Lucas said softly. His voice sounded hollow, stripped of its usual warmth. "He walked out into the dark without it. He could barely stand." "I know," I replied, sitting up, pulling the sheet around my waist. Lucas turned his head, looking at me in the dim light filtering through the window blinds. "I need to go to the estate, Gianna. I need to make sure he made it back. I need to talk to him." I did not argue. I threw the sheets off and reached for my jeans. "I am coming with you." The drive down Highway 31 felt infinitely longer than my previous trips. The dark silhouette of the sugarcane fields loomed like imposing walls on either side of the road. We turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the Thorne estate. The massive, hollowed-out live oaks cast jagged shadows across the hood of our car. The sprawling, white-pillared mansion was dark, save for a single light burning in the rear of the house. Lucas parked the car near the back entrance. We walked up the wooden stairs to the service porch. The door was unlocked. Lucas pushed it open, stepping into the massive, cavernous kitchen of the estate. Elias Thorne was sitting at a large, distressed oak island. He was not drinking expensive bourbon from a crystal glass, surrounded by the trappings of his agricultural empire. The corporate lawyers from Baton Rouge were nowhere to be found. The Titan of St. Martin Parish sat slumped on a wooden stool, wearing the same rumpled jacket from the wedding. Resting on the counter in front of him was a clear plastic Tupperware container. I recognized the container immediately. It was one of several packed by my sister-in-law at the end of the reception. Inside was leftover jambalaya and a portion of the crawfish étouffée the community had prepared for the wedding. Eating cold leftovers straight from the fridge is a staple of Acadian post-party wine-downs, a decidedly working-class comfort ritual. Elias held a plastic fork, slowly eating the cold rice and crawfish. It was the ultimate, devastating symbol of his surrender. The billionaire who had rejected our lifestyle, who had predicted Lucas would drown in the mediocrity of a working-class existence, was sitting alone in the dark, finding comfort in the very culture he had despised. Lucas stepped fully into the kitchen. Elias paused, his hand trembling as he lowered the plastic fork. He looked up, the pale blue eyes clouded with exhaustion and the lingering redness of his tears. He did not look angry that we had entered his home uninvited. He simply looked resigned, bracing himself for the anger he believed his son had come to deliver. Lucas pulled out a stool across the island from his father and sat down. I remained standing near the doorway, leaning against the doorframe. This was their moment. I refused to intervene. I had spent 2 decades shielding Lucas from the Thorne legacy, managing the emotional fallout of his disinheritance. Tonight, I needed to step back. I needed to let my husband claim his agency and speak to his father without my interference. "You paid the hospital bill," Lucas said, his voice quiet, devoid of accusation. Elias looked down at the plastic container. "You were drowning, Lucas. You were a substitute teacher with no insurance. They were going to bankrupt you before the child even came home. I could not let that happen." "But you never called," Lucas pressed, the old pain surfacing, raw and aching. "You never came to the hospital. You let me believe you did not care if she lived or died." Elias closed his eyes, a deep, shuddering breath lifting his frail shoulders. "If I had come to the hospital, I would have demanded you return to the estate. I would have used the money to force you back under my control. You chose your life, Lucas. You chose your pride. I knew if you discovered I paid the debt, you would feel obligated to surrender. I stayed away so you could keep your dignity." The confession hung in the air, heavy and agonizing. Elias had weaponized his silence to protect his son's independence. It was a twisted, deeply flawed manifestation of love, but it was love nonetheless. "Then why attack us now?" Lucas asked, genuine confusion furrowing his brow. "Mia found the ledger. We know you saved her. But 2 days ago, you filed a legal boundary dispute against Gianna's marshland. You placed a lien on our name. You froze our credit and nearly ruined the wedding you paid to ensure she lived to see. Why?" Elias frowned, looking up from the counter. "I did not file a lien to ruin the wedding. I filed the dispute because the Environmental Protection Agency is preparing to seize that land." Lucas blinked, turning his head to look at me standing in the doorway. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The fire in the cane fields had to burn away the final rot. I stepped forward, moving away from the safety of the doorframe. My hands were shaking, but my voice remained steady. "It is true," I confessed, holding Lucas's gaze. "I pulled the environmental surveys yesterday. My father illegally buried hundreds of barrels of toxic agricultural pesticide on that 15-acre tract in the 1980s. The EPA discovered the dumping site. They are gearing up to levy catastrophic federal fines against the current owner. Lucas stared at me, the shock registering on his features. You own that land, Gianna. The fines would fall on us. They would bankrupt us instantly, I confirmed, my throat tight. I turned my attention to Elias. He did not file the boundary dispute to steal the land. He filed it to legally tether the toxic parcel to the Thorn agricultural empire. He was using his corporate lawyers to absorb the incoming fines, shielding us from my father's crimes. Lucas looked back at his father, the years of resentment washing away completely, leaving behind a profound, exhausted grief. His father was not a monster. He was a flawed, aging man desperately trying to protect his son from the shadows. But Broussard knew, I continued, the anger flashing hot in my veins as I outlined the betrayal. Your estate manager found out about the EPA fines. He knew absorbing the penalty would damage the estate's liquidity. Broussard orchestrated a shadow negotiation behind your back, Elias. He offered me the parish hall for the wedding if I signed a quitclaim deed transferring the land away from the Thorn estate, ensuring the federal fines would annihilate my family instead of yours. Elias gripped the edge of the oak island, his knuckles turning white. The betrayal of his trusted manager struck him hard, his breathing growing shallow. Did you sign it? Lucas asked, his voice laced with sudden panic. Gianna, did you sign the land away? I looked at my husband, the tears I had held back all evening finally spilling over my lashes. I did, I admitted, my voice cracking. I signed it because I was desperate to save Mia's wedding. But when I discovered the truth about the toxic dumping, I intercepted the filing. I used an archival loophole in the parish property codes. I restructured the transfer. I legally tethered the toxic parcel and the entirety of the impending EPA environmental fines directly to Broussard's Personal Management LLC. I trapped him. Silence fell over the kitchen. The sheer magnitude of the deception, the toxic legacy of my father, and the ruthless tactical warfare I had waged to protect us hung heavily in the room. I took a step closer to the island, looking directly at Elias. I hated your father for 25 years, I confessed to Lucas, the tears streaming down my face. I blamed him for everything hard in our lives. I used his reputation to justify my own anger. But yesterday, looking at the environmental reports, I realized my own father was the true villain. He poisoned the land for a quick payout and left us holding the bomb. I wiped my cheeks with the back of my hand, offering an ugly, vulnerable truth. I did not just surrender the land to save the venue, Lucas, I admitted, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I surrendered it because I secretly hated my father's corrupt legacy just as much as you hated yours. I wanted to be rid of it. Lucas stood up from the stool. He walked around the island, closing the distance between us. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a tight, desperate embrace. I buried my face against his chest, the exhaustion pulling me under. For the first time in 25 years, the Thorn men sat in the same room, united not by the vast wealth of the agricultural empire, but by the devastating weight of the truth. The ghosts of the past had been confronted. The toxic secrets had been exposed. The foundation of our family was fractured, but it was finally clean, stripped down to the bare, honest studs. We stayed in the dim kitchen for hours, talking softly, navigating the wreckage of the past. But the peace we forged in the early morning hours was precarious. The sun was preparing to rise over the bayou, and with the daylight would come the brutal, inevitable fallout of the legal traps I had set. Broussard would discover the restructuring of the deed. The corporate lawyers in Baton Rouge would realize Elias had breached his isolation. The final battle for the Thorn estate was imminent, and we were standing directly in the crossfire. The dawn of a new legacy. The morning sun finally crested over the sprawling sugarcane fields, casting long golden light through the kitchen windows of the Thorne estate. It was a beautiful, quiet Sunday, but the real storm arrived precisely at 9 o'clock on Monday. Broussard stormed into the parish clerk's office, his face purple with a terrifying, apoplectic rage. He had just received the finalized filings. The catastrophic environmental debt of my father's toxic dumping was now legally and permanently bolted to his personal LLC. He threatened to sue, but his own arrogant signature on the proxy documents sealed his absolute ruin. He had tried to weaponize the land, but the archaic property laws of Louisiana had swallowed him whole. Elias wasted no time. With Lucas standing firmly by his side, he dismissed the corporate lawyers from Baton Rouge, terminating their exorbitant billing hours and taking back control of his own ending. Lucas did not suddenly transform into a ruthless agricultural baron. Instead, he took an administrative leave from his teaching position to help his father restructure the estate, focusing on sustainable practices and healing the land that had been exploited for generations. Elias is fading, his memory slipping a little more each week, but he is no longer isolated in a corporate cage. He spends his afternoons sitting on the veranda, watching Mia and her new husband visit, finally allowed to simply be a grandfather. Looking back at the wreckage and the redemption of those frantic weeks, the truths we unearthed fundamentally changed how I view the world. If this grueling journey has taught me anything, it is that clinging to a rigid narrative of hatred is a poison that blinds you to hidden grace. I spent 2 decades so convinced of my own righteous victimhood that I nearly missed the silent, staggering sacrifices being made on my family's behalf. I also learned that deception, even when born from a desperate, agonizing desire to protect the ones you love, only fractures the very foundation you are trying to save. Truth, no matter how ugly or painful, is the only soil where genuine trust can grow. Moreover, I realized that pride is the most expensive, agonizing prison a person can ever build. It cost Elias 25 years of precious memories with his only son, a devastating price that billions of dollars in sugarcane revenue could never refund. Ultimately, true wealth is never measured by the acreage you command or the immaculate credit score you maintain. It is measured entirely by the people who choose to stand beside you when the world falls apart. Thank you for walking through this incredible, harrowing journey with me here in May 2026. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to dismantle your own pride to heal your family, please take a moment to support this community. This is Maya Tells Stories, and I earnestly ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is deeply appreciated. It helps the channel be maintained, ensures we can continue further developing this platform, and guarantees you will not miss any of the other captivating stories I have waiting for you. Hit that subscribe button, share your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you in the next story.